Hello everyone. So I was looking through my channel recently and I found out that I have 800 subscribers. Usually this is something YouTube likes to notify me about, but I had to find the number myself after putting up a new video. So if you've been to this channel, you'll notice that I do a few book reviews every so often. I like to do a lot of reading, and I also collect a fair bit of books as well. So I figured, for my 800 subscriber special, I would go through all the books of my collection, and maybe just do a little quick review along the way. Let's get started. I've actually got 2 bookshelves, but I figured it'd probably be easier if I took them one at a time. This is the lesser one, so I'm going to go through every single book that I have here. The first collection is all the James Bond books that I have. Starting with the first one, Casino Royale. This particular version was given to me by a coworker. I was plowing through all the James Bond books at the time, and he wanted to give me this for Christmas. It's also fun to note that on the back, it actually says how much it costs in pounds. So it came from the UK. In general, though, I prefer the Signet versions. While this may seem a bit like a copy-paste for most of the covers, I feel like there's a bit of originality here as well. The typing may be the same, but the little picture in the middle is where it gets interesting. So in this one, we have the picture of Mr. Big. And I can tell you right now that unlike Casino Royale, which seems like about maybe 20 minutes of the movie, this only really feels like the movie with just a few characters because a Mr. Big and a Baron Samedi are part of it. However, they're the same character in this book. And also I feel like there's a few little references used in here for License to Kill. So it's kind of funny how I was talking about Signet. This one was actually by Bantam, I want to say. It was also very interesting to kind of get an illustration as to what the James Bond of the books looks like as opposed to ones of the movie. And I gotta tell you, when I was reading this at college, I was a little concerned that this picture was going to be a little too much for some of the teachers. So whenever I read it, I made sure I had like a thumb like right there just to adequately censor it. But it is interesting when you read the book. These are actually various scenes that happen. James Bond drives a green Bentley. This is an artist representation of what Hugo Drax looks like. There is one time where he is sunbathing on the cliffs of Dover, I want to say, and they're both naked, so that's why it's very scantily clad there, and that's Bond, as I said before. Then we get back into the Signet versions. This was actually the first one that I bought online. Usually I like to try to look for these in the stores, but I just kind of got tired of waiting. And one other thing that's interesting about the Signet version is I love how they have red pages. It kind of makes it look like it's been soaked in blood. But let me think. In terms of comparing this one to the movie, I feel like the book is a little better, but one of the major differences is after Live and Let Die, part of Felix's arm was ripped off by a crocodile, so whenever he showed up, he subsequently just had this giant hook at his side. And he also had a trademark car, a fusion of a Cadillac and a Studebaker, and he called it a Studilac. There's a fun chase scene involving that car in this book. And the crazy thing is, so the villain isn't Blofeld in this one, but the villain that actually does exist, I forget his name, he does have 2 henchmen named Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, both portrayed as homosexual. However, it's in a rather negative light here in the book, while in the movie it's somewhat adequate, I think. You can feel free to debate me on that. But anyway, the main thing that's interesting was the main villain's hideout, which was actually in an old west town. So it was crazy that there was like saloons as well as like a full running train and all this other stuff. That's something I wish could be translated into the movies, but I guess it was just a little too hokey. Then this one I was honestly a little disappointed in terms of the cover. because you can clearly see that it's trying to promote the movie that just came out with Sean Connery. In fact, the back is really just an advertisement for said movie. Now, there was actually an other version that Signet produced that had a different cover. If I remember correctly, it's Bond on the train with Tatiana. Now, in terms of like movie to film adaptation, I feel like this one is probably the closest. Although the events are a little out of order. For instance, the book starts off by introducing who Donald Grant is. However, I talked more about that when I actually reviewed this book earlier, so I'll leave my thoughts there. And then we are on to Dr. No. Wow, this is a really weird one, actually. So much like the movie, Dr. No is very much shrouded in secret, but it seems like whoever is interested in them ends up dead, very much like the movie. But where the major difference is the character of Honey Rider, who is basically like Snow White because she is so used to nature. It's like she can almost talk to animals, and thus is able to actually escape being eaten alive by crab. Which, a fun fact, they did try to bring in the crab eating scene into the movie, but unfortunately the crabs just didn't really look all that authentic, so they figured it'd be easier to just have the water slowly rising instead. But probably the two craziest things about this book. So the first is the whole famous suspense scene. So in the movie, there's a tarantula walking all over James Bond. In the book, it is a giant centipede, which if I saw that instead of the tarantula, I would just be freaking out. I just don't do well with normal centipedes, let alone ones the size of a snake that could kill people. That, I think, was far more effective than the tarantula. But the other crazy thing is, so Dr. No, there is kind of a vague idea that he is toppling missiles, which is brought up in the movie. But what isn't brought up in the movie is that he was always curious about the strengths of a person, how far you can push them before they can completely crack. And so, Bond is thrown into this survival maze of, so to speak, which it's kind of in the movie. However, there's no fight against a giant squid where he had nothing to fight it off with other than the knife that he stole from the table for his last meal. It's one of those things that's like both hokey but also kind of awesome at the same time. And then we are on the Goldfinger. Now this one I reviewed already, but this was a really good one. Although it still kind of bugs me in the idea that one of the characters is basically killed because she was a lesbian. If she just went with James Bond, the heterosexual man, she would have still lived. Well, that's about as far as I'll go into a social justice warrior rant, but it was also kind of interesting that I was actually finishing up the last few chapters as I was getting my COVID vaccine. So I guess that memory kind of sticks with me. And also the memory of them raiding Fort Knox. It's very similar to how it was with COVID. Yeah. For Your Eyes Only was a little bit of an odd one. Instead of it being one long story, it was actually a combination of several short stories, which you might remember the name of the first one, called A View to a Kill. It doesn't really match up with the Christopher Walken movie at all, but it has the same title. You got For Your Eyes Only. Then it was Risiko and the Hildebrand Rarity, which I remember the Hildebrand Rarity was more of just like a jolly little detective story than like deep thrilling espionage like first three. And in fact, I feel like some elements of Risiko made its way into for the movie For Your Eyes Only as well. And then we have the making into a Nintendo 64 game, The Spy Who Loved Me. Now this one just has like nothing to do with the movie. The only real connection is I guess there was this one character with like really weird teeth or something like that. But for the most part, this book is all about a character known as Vivian Michelle, who is going to be the contact in one of the levels, actually. That idea was quickly scrapped when we got Coral Jr., and we figured we needed Felix Leiter in there. But I'm getting off subject. So because this one is about Vivian Michelle, it's Ian Fleming trying to write as a woman, and some people say he doesn't do a good job with that. I mean, I'm not really much of a critic with that kind of stuff. I mean, how are women supposed to sound in literature? I feel like that's the bigger question right there. But when James Bond does show up, it's not until the end of the book, and it's pretty exciting last few chapters when he does show up. But if you were expecting something similar to the movie, pick up the novelization of the movie by Christoph Wood, I want to say his name is. Up next is Thunderball. Now this one I do remember reviewing, and much like the movie itself, I mean, it's okay, but there wasn't really a whole lot in here that just kept making me go, ooh, I want to see what happens next. It was more just kind of like, okay, it seems similar to the movie, and that one. And another part of me wanted to read this to see how similar it was to the rip-off James Bond movie, Never Say Never Again. But obviously the one with the same name of Thunderball is a lot closer to the book. And then it's on to the first James Bond book I ever bought, which was On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Now, as you can tell, when I picked it up, it was in very rough shape, so I kind of taped some index cards to hold it together. That way I'd have a little something to hold on to. And I tried my best to draw the rest of it. Now what I found rather interesting is I looked up what this cover is supposed to look like. And this little griffin on the bottom is having both of his hands out holding what looks like a Walther BPK. And this is another one that was really close to the movie. I mean, only a few minor details, but it's basically the same. And one of those minor details is the Blofeld of the book has hair. I know, right? You're used to seeing Blofeld as bald, stroking the white Persian cap, but no, he has hair in this version. And he's probably like, I don't know, mid-30s, I wager. Kind of almost a dark side of Bond in ways. And then it's on to my personal favorite Bond movie, You Only Live Twice. And the book itself, I think, is just as good. However, there was actually quite a fair bit of difference between the book and the movie. However, I also reviewed this one as well, so I don't want to go too crazy into the details. And then on to the last one that Ian Fleming wrote, The Man with the Golden Gun. Now, I'm well aware that The Living Daylights, as well as Octopussy, and a few other little short stories were written by Ian Fleming as well. Unfortunately, I have not found them. And plus, I'm more about like the full-length adventures. I feel like I'm getting ripped off when I read the miniature ones. And I hear a lot of people say this isn't necessarily their favorite book, but at the same time, it is a little hard to fault it because Ian Fleming was literally dying when he finished this book. In fact, I'm not even sure if he was alive to actually see it get published. But this book was able to do one thing that I kind of hope that the next movie after No Time to Die is going to do. So after the events of You Only Live Twice, James Bond has amnesia and figures that he's just a Japanese person that was going to be content to live the rest of his life on a little island. However, he found a newspaper that involved the KGB, and that triggered a very strong memory. So he went to the KGB. They brainwashed him into believing that MI6 was the real KGB and that the KGB was MI6, and Bond was sent over there to kill M. And it gets really close. In fact, if it wasn't for the speed of this shield of bulletproof glass, the M would have been toast. And I feel like this could make a very good pre-title sequence. Basically saying that, like, oh yeah, Bond is alive, he's just been brainwashed. And plus, I could imagine, like, the pre-title sequence would start, like, right after the bullet hits the glass, like, just this far away from M's head. And then, as M says, take him away, they zoom into the bullet hole, and that's when the pre-title sequence starts. But then again, I'm not part of Eon Productions, and, well, I don't think they're going to buy the rights to that idea if they actually are going to use it. Up next are the Lord of the Rings books. So, the first one I have right here, I believe I briefly discussed it in my book review. But the main thing to keep in mind is that any other Lord of the Rings book going forward would say the official authorized version, because the author did not authorize these versions. And while there was quite a horrible lawsuit and all these books had to be recalled, the author was actually noted, saying that he rather enjoyed the covers of these ones compared to the official ones that Huffington Mifflin put out later. However, what's interesting is if you look really closely, there's a bit of writing here. If you get all three books together, it actually continues across all three covers. What it says, I unfortunately don't know, because I've looked up every single Lord of the Rings alphabet, and there are several characters that just don't match in there. What's interesting is that tradition carried through when Huffington Mifflin took over later. See if I can show this correctly, but if you put all three books together, it creates one long picture. I got the order mixed up. There we are. See how it all just kind of blends together? It's a very unique thing because it makes it so you kind of have to collect them all. Now there is another book series I'll be showing you that does the same thing. The major difference is, unlike this, where I was able to get all three books within the span of a month, the third book I was looking for took several years to be able to find and thus complete the picture. I already reviewed these books, so I figured I'll just leave it there. One of the other things to note is The Hobbit. I was a little disappointed as I was kind of hoping this cover would blend with the rest of the Lord of the Rings covers in some way, but no such luck. This one I've been kind of back and forth on trying to find, actually. So the crazy thing is I found this particular version at a garage sale for like 25 cents. However, the cover itself was completely ripped off. So, I was actually able to take the cover off another Hobbit book that I picked up for 50 cents this time, and I put it on this one. Now, it was really just the front cover because the spine was intact and the back was intact. Maybe someday I'll do a review of The Hobbit like I did on The Lord of the Rings, but for now I just wanted to show off what this particular version looks like. This one I literally just got done reviewing, so the main thing I'll just note is that this one is by Signet, which published my favorite covers of all the Bond books. However, I feel like this one is pretty lame. On to the next one, we got The Last Unicorn. Once again, I did a review of this one, but I do very much like the cover art. It is rather unique, and it almost makes it look even more mystical, selling the whole medieval fantasy theme. And then it's on to probably the most controversial book that I have. Yeah. What can I say? It's pretty much been a Halloween tradition to see the first two movies, and I was rather curious to see how the book compared. And yes, I know that the author has a rather bad reputation, but it seems like a lot of people can still like the character even if they hate the author. It's what I like to call the Woody Allen approach. Now, the main reason I say that is because Woody Allen is a very famous actor, director, movie producer. He's done a lot in the filmmaking industry. A lot of people like his work, but they hate him for a human being. I'll have you look that up as to what he actually did that deserves such animosity. However, another thing I want to mention as well is this was the version I was used to seeing. I'm not sure if this is something that a lot of schools do anymore, but there was what was known as the Scholastics Book Fair. And this, as well as some of the other Harry Potter books, was always on sale. And this is the version that I was used to seeing a lot when I was growing up. The cover art, as well as the embossment. And maybe it's just me, but if you ever play 1313 Dead End Drive, I feel like it's a very similar art style. I do like the more cartoonish aesthetic. And it was always kind of funny because I remember a lot of the other kids would be reading this, and I don't know. I just saw there wasn't any pictures, and I'm just kind of like, why does this interest you? This next one I mostly just picked up because I just wanted it in my collection. Dianetics by Rod Hubbard. They say it was kind of the foundings in this book that would later inspire the Church of Scientology. Unless maybe I'm just getting it mixed up with the founder of L. Rod Hubbard. I never read this, and well, quite frankly, this looks like it's gonna take a while, but all the same, I just thought it was a very interesting thing to own. Not sure if I'll ever actually read it, though. So, as you probably know, I've always loved reading the classics, and I found this one, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, I can definitely say when I found out how, like, thick the pages were, I kind of became a little less enthused as to actually reading it. But maybe someday I'll actually get around to it. And now it's on to the oldest book in my collection, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. And I like the idea that the back is an advertisement for an old piano. Now, what's very interesting about this book is that the pages themselves are not very consistent. Sometimes they're a little thicker than the others. But in general, it almost feels like I'm reading it off of what we today called cardstock. I'm not sure if it's actually worth anything, but I want to say this was like the second edition, and being from the late 1800s, I can't imagine too many of these are floating around. But one of the things I can tell you, while this book has been adapted into several fun adventure movies, this one is actually kind of dark. I mean, it's all about Jim Hawkins wanting to go on to this big, fantastic adventure. But once he finishes, he's like, yeah, I'm just gonna go back to living normal life again. I hated this. I lost several people, and several people that I thought were my friends ended up being my enemies. I'm just gonna go back to the way life was before. And yeah, I've yet to see an adaptation that ends on a more sour note like that. Once again, another classic that I just never really got around to, Swiss Family Robinson. Now I get the idea that there's probably a paper covering that's supposed to go on the outside of this, because as of now, this just looks very plain, but at least it's written on the front. And then it's on to one of the other hardcover books I have, Alice in Wonderland. So, while the front of it says Alice in Wonderland, it also has Through the Looking Glass here as well. And what I like is that you have pictures in it as well. What can I say? Like, I read big books now, but sometimes it's just fun to see little pictures. And probably what I found the most fascinating, so people always talk about the Disney version, how they wished there was the sequel. In fact, Alice in Wonderland was the first, and then the second one was Through the Looking Glass. However, the crazy thing is, most of what is in the Disney version is actually from Through the Looking Glass. Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the Walrus and the Carpenter, the Queen of Hearts. As for like the Tim Burton version, it just never really struck my interest. I'm not really too big a fan of the darker stuff, and plus there is that famous decapitation scene and that kind of stuff. No, thank you. Now on to the last pile of that bookshelf. So, I'm gonna hold this one off to the side because I want to talk about it more in detail when I get to the next bookshelf, actually. The first two are classics that I just didn't get the chance to get around to yet. The Last of the Mohicans, and, well, this one's actually a double feature, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. You know, it's getting around to October, and it's definitely short enough. Maybe I will read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Maybe do a bit of a comparison between that and the Disney movie. I'm not going to be doing the Johnny Depp version, obviously. Then we have The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. I just love the cover of this one. It kind of has like that atomic age sort of look to it, which is kind of weird because the book takes place in the 1800s. However, that doesn't take away the fact that this was a pretty good book. And I've read some of H.G. Wells' works before, like War of the Worlds, as well as The Time Machine. But The Invisible Man itself is very different, as it feels a lot more grounded in reality, I guess. Basically, this man finds the ability to make a potion that turn himself completely invisible. But what's interesting is instead of using these powers for good, he uses them for quite malicious intent. And the interesting thing is, so if you were to put like a coat on or something, there would just be like a floating coat. So when he's completely invisible, that just means he's running around naked. It was kind of interesting to see that the title character really turned out to kind of be the villain. The Great Gatsby. This was one that I read in high school, actually. It wasn't required reading. I just liked the classics. However, if you would ask me what this book was about, I'd have a very hard time telling you. I read it from cover to cover, but I honestly don't remember much of a thing about it. The only way I do remember this is I remember after we all graduated high school, we all went to this very big mall, and there was a movie theater, and they were playing The Great Gatsby, the one with Leonardo DiCaprio in it. And if it wasn't for that movie, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you what this book is about. Now, a lot of people mostly say that this book is just another story about a man cheating on his wife. But this is the story about a man cheating on his wife. Now, what does that mean? It just means this is kind of the pinnacle of that. I'm not really too big a fan of that particular genre, but people tell me it's, well, great. Maybe someday I'll actually get around to reading this and see if it's any good or not. Now this one, I did a review of on my channel, and yeah, this was a good one. I like her rather candid narrative style, but it also just bursts my mind because, while I know the idea of transgender people have been around for a while, it's just hearing about somebody going through it through the 50s and the 60s. And yet, it seems like nobody's heard of her. Like, if I were to talk to an old person, I'd be like, hey, do you know who Christine Jorgensen is? They'd be like, it seemed like it caused a worldwide scandal, yet nobody's from that time seems to remember her. But all the same, this was a fantastic book. I had a very hard time putting it down. But then this one. So dedicated fans of my channel might know that for a while I did some reviews on some of the old Sherlock Holmes movies. My personal favorite actor is Basil Rathbone, which I reviewed like the first, I want to say, 4 movies that he did, but it didn't really go anywhere. However, I was always a big fan of Sherlock Holmes the character, and so I picked up this. This, as far as I know, is all stories of the great detective, or at least all the shorter ones, and it'd be kind of curious to see how much they match up with the Basil Rathbone equivalents. However, some of them they actually invented for their own. In fact, it gives a little bit of a list of everything that is in this book. I like Sherlock Holmes, and eventually I'll probably get around to reading it. I did read The Hound of the Baskerville, and that was pretty good. Now it's on to the next bookshelf. It's a little bit bigger, but I have a feeling I can probably cover all these and still keep it interesting.